My name is Evangeline Clare, though everyone calls me Evie, and this is the story of how a stolen family heirloom led me to discover that my sister had married a federal fugitive. It started 6 months ago when my grandfather died, leaving me his vintage Rolex Submariner in his will. 3 weeks ago, I found out my sister Jessica had secretly sold it to fund her husband Ryan's business scheme. I was devastated until yesterday when a pawnshop owner called with news that would change everything. What he found hidden inside that watch would expose Ryan as a wanted criminal and nearly destroy my family. But I'm getting ahead of myself. 6 months ago, I lost the most important man in my life. Not my father, though I lost him too when I was 16 in a construction accident that shattered our family. I'm talking about my grandfather, William Hayes, the man who stepped in when everything fell apart and somehow held us all together with his steady hands and endless patience. I'm 28 now, working as a senior marketing manager at TechFlow Solutions here in San Diego, and I should probably mention that I've always been the responsible one in my family. While my older sister Jessica was out partying through high school and college, I was the one sitting at grandfather's kitchen table every Sunday listening to his Navy stories and learning about life from a man who'd seen more of the world than anyone I knew. Grandfather William was everything my father might have been if that crane hadn't malfunctioned on the job site 12 years ago. After Dad died, Mom kind of shut down emotionally. Patricia Clare had been a high school English teacher, the kind who believed in the power of literature to change lives, but losing her husband at 46 broke something fundamental in her. She kept teaching, kept functioning, but the light in her eyes dimmed to almost nothing. That's when Grandfather moved from his little apartment in Hillcrest to our house in Poway. He never made it feel like charity or obligation. He just showed up one day with his sea bag and his stories and announced that his granddaughters needed someone to teach them how to change a tire and balance a checkbook. Mom didn't argue. I think she was too tired to argue about anything anymore. Jessica was 18, then already rebellious and angry about Dad's death in ways that made her lash out at everyone trying to help. She'd always been the golden child, the one with perfect grades and perfect friends and a perfect boyfriend who drove a perfect car. But grief made her reckless, and Grandfather's presence felt like another adult trying to control her life. She moved out for college 6 months later and never really moved back, not emotionally anyway. Me. I was just grateful to have someone who remembered to ask about my day and show up for my volleyball games. Grandfather taught me to drive in his old Ford pickup, the one that smelled like coffee and Old Spice, and something indefinably comforting that I later realized was just the scent of safety. He was the one who helped me with my college applications, who drove me to UC San Diego for orientation, who called every week during my freshman year to make sure I was eating enough vegetables. When he had his heart attack 6 months ago, I was the one who found him. I'd stopped by his house after work because he'd missed our regular Tuesday dinner, something that had never happened in 12 years. He was in his favorite armchair, still wearing the blue cardigan Mom had knitted him for his 74th birthday, looking like he'd just closed his eyes for a moment. The funeral was everything Grandfather would have hated. Too much fuss, too many flowers, too many people saying things they should have said while he was alive to hear them. Jessica flew in from her perfect life in Scripps Ranch with her perfect husband Ryan, playing the part of the grieving granddaughter for the cameras and the neighbors. She even cried at the right moments, though I wondered if the tears were real or just another performance. The will reading happened a week later in David Hayes' office downtown. David had been Grandfather's lawyer and friend for over 30 years, one of those old-school attorneys who still wore bow ties and kept hard candy in a crystal dish on his desk. Most of Grandfather's estate went to various charities, particularly organizations that helped military veterans and their families. The house would be sold, and the proceeds donated to Habitat for Humanity. But there was one specific bequest that made my heart stop. To my beloved granddaughter, Evangeline Clare, I leave my Rolex Submariner watch purchased with my first Navy paycheck in 1970. May it remind her that time is precious, and that she has always been the most precious part of mine. I started crying right there in David's office, remembering how Grandfather used to let me wind that watch when I was little, how he'd taught me to read the time on its classic face before I even started kindergarten. The watch was worth maybe $22,000, not a fortune by any means, but it represented something money couldn't buy. It was proof that he'd seen me, really seen me, in a way that sometimes felt like I was invisible to everyone else. Jessica's face went through several emotions during that reading: surprise, hurt, and something that looked uncomfortably like jealousy. She didn't say anything in the moment, just pressed her lips together in that way she'd done since childhood when things didn't go according to her plans. After the meeting, I went to Mom's house to pick up the watch. She'd been keeping Grandfather's jewelry in her bedroom safe, along with Dad's wedding ring and a few other family treasures. But when she opened the safe and handed me the small leather box, my heart sank before I even lifted the lid. The box was empty. Mom's face went white when she saw my expression. She fumbled through the other items in the safe, checking behind documents and in corners, like the watch might have somehow fallen out of its designated spot. But it was gone. The one thing Grandfather had wanted me to have, the one physical connection to all those Sunday dinners and bedtime stories and quiet moments when it felt like we were the only two people in the world who understood each other. It was gone, and I had no idea where to even begin looking for it. I drove to Jessica's house the next morning with a sick feeling in my stomach that had nothing to do with the coffee I'd skipped for breakfast. Her neighborhood in Scripps Ranch was the kind of place where every lawn was perfectly manicured and every house looked like it belonged in a magazine spread about successful living. Jessica and Ryan's house was a sprawling Mediterranean-style villa with a circular driveway and enough square footage to house 3 normal families. The BMW in the driveway was new, something sleek and silver that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. I'd never understood how Jessica afforded this lifestyle on a real estate agent's commission, especially in a market as competitive as San Diego's, but she'd always been good at making things look easier than they actually were. Ryan answered the door before I even had a chance to ring the bell. He was one of those men who'd probably been handsome in college, but was starting to show the effects of too much good living and not enough exercise. His smile was practiced, the kind that looked genuine, until you realized it never quite reached his eyes. "Evie," he said, spreading his arms like we were old friends instead of family members who barely tolerated each other. "What a nice surprise." Come in, come in. Jessica's just finishing up a call with a client." I followed him through their marble foyer into a living room that looked like a furniture showroom. Everything was beige and cream and perfectly coordinated, the kind of space that felt more like a hotel lobby than somewhere people actually lived. There were no family photos, no personal touches, just expensive furniture arranged for maximum visual impact. Jessica appeared a few minutes later, still holding her phone and looking harried in the way that suggested her morning wasn't going according to plan. She was 33 but could have passed for younger, thanks to what I suspected was regular help from a dermatologist and possibly a plastic surgeon. Her blonde hair was styled in loose waves that looked effortless, but probably took an hour to achieve. "Evie," she said, and there was something in her voice that made me think she'd been expecting this visit. "What brings you by? I'm looking for Grandfather's watch," I said, deciding there was no point in small talk. Mom had it in her safe, but now it's missing. Jessica's expression didn't change, but I caught the quick glance she exchanged with Ryan. It was subtle, the kind of look that passes between people who share secrets, and it made my stomach clench with a new kind of dread. "That's terrible," Jessica said, settling onto the cream-colored sofa and gesturing for me to sit across from her. "Have you called the police?" "Maybe someone broke into Mom's house." "Nothing else was taken," I replied, staying standing. "Just the watch." And there were no signs of a break-in. Ryan moved to stand behind Jessica's chair, his hands resting on her shoulders in a gesture that looked supportive, but felt possessive. "Well, that is strange," he said. "Patricia's always been so careful about security. Remember when she had that new alarm system installed after your grandfather passed? The way he said Grandfather's name, like William, had been some distant acquaintance, instead of the man who'd helped raise his wife, set my teeth on edge. Ryan had a talent for making everything sound reasonable, while somehow missing the emotional core of every situation. Jessica was fidgeting with her wedding ring, spinning it around her finger, in a nervous habit I remembered from childhood. She'd done the same thing before piano recitals and math tests anytime she was about to be caught in a lie. "I'm sure it'll turn up," she said finally. "You know how Mom's been since Grandfather died. Maybe she moved it somewhere safe and forgot. But even as she said it, Jessica couldn't quite meet my eyes. I'd grown up with this woman, shared a bedroom with her until I was 10 years old, and I knew when she was hiding something. The question was whether she was protecting someone else's secret or keeping one of her own. Maybe you should check with David Hayes, Ryan suggested. Sometimes lawyers keep valuable items in their office safes during estate proceedings. There might have been some paperwork that needed to be completed first. His suggestion sounded reasonable, the kind of practical advice that made sense on the surface. But something about the way he offered it, like he was steering me away from asking more questions here, made me even more suspicious. "That's a good idea," Jessica said quickly, standing up like the conversation was over. "You should definitely call David's office." I looked between them, these two people who lived in perfect surroundings and drove perfect cars and seemed to have perfect lives, and I felt like I was standing outside a window looking in at something I wasn't meant to understand. There was a tension in the room that had nothing to do with concern about a missing watch, and everything to do with secrets I couldn't even begin to guess at. Ryan's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it with the kind of focused attention that suggested business was calling. Speaking of which, he said to Jessica, "I need to take this call. The Denver project is moving faster than expected." He kissed the top of her head and disappeared into what I assumed was his home office, leaving Jessica and me alone for the first time since I'd arrived. I thought this might be my chance to get some honest answers, but Jessica seemed even more guarded without her husband's presence. "Is everything okay?" I asked. "You seem nervous." Jessica laughed, but it sounded forced. "I'm fine, just busy. You know how it is trying to close deals before the end of the quarter." I didn't know, actually. My job at TechFlow was demanding, but it didn't require the kind of constant performance that seemed to define Jessica's life. She'd always been driven, but something about her energy felt different now. Frantic, maybe, or desperate in a way that expensive clothes and perfect makeup couldn't quite hide. "Family loyalty is everything," Evie Ryan's voice carried from the hallway as he returned, sliding his phone into his pocket. "I hope you understand what's best for Jessica's happiness. Sometimes digging into the past just hurts people we love." There was something in his tone that made my skin crawl, a subtle threat wrapped in concern. He was smiling, but his eyes were cold, and I suddenly felt like I was in a room with someone who wasn't quite what he pretended to be. "I think I should go," I said, moving toward the door before I could think better of it. Jessica walked me out, her hand light on my arm, but her grip surprisingly tight. "Let me know what David says about the watch," she said. "I'm sure there's a simple explanation." But as I drove away from their perfect house in their perfect neighborhood, I couldn't shake the feeling that my sister knew exactly where grandfather's watch was. And more troubling still, I was starting to suspect that Ryan's sudden interest in family loyalty had everything to do with keeping me from finding out the truth. I called Mom as soon as I got home, my hands shaking as I dialed her number. The conversation with Jessica and Ryan had left me feeling unsettled in ways I couldn't quite articulate, and I needed to hear Mom's voice, needed the comfort of someone who loved grandfather as much as I did. Patricia Clare answered on the third ring, her voice thick with the kind of exhaustion that had become her default since losing both her husband and her father within 12 years of each other. "Evie," she said. "How did things go with Jessica?" "That's what I'm calling about," I said, settling onto my couch and trying to keep my voice calm. "Mom, I need you to think carefully about the last time you saw grandfather's watch." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that spoke louder than words. When Mom finally answered, her voice was small and guilty. "Oh, honey," she said, "I was hoping Jessica would have talked to you by now." My stomach dropped. "Talk to me about what?" She asked to borrow it. Mom said the words coming out in a rush, like she'd been holding them back for weeks. "Just temporarily. Ryan needed some quick capital for a business opportunity, and Jessica said they'd pay it back with interest within 30 days. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. You let her borrow grandfather's watch, Mom. That was my inheritance. That was specifically left to me in his will. I know, sweetheart, and I feel terrible about it." But Jessica was so upset. She said Ryan had this chance to invest in a development project, something that could set them up for life, but they needed cash immediately, and all their money was tied up in other investments. I was already grabbing my keys, my anger making it hard to think straight. "I'm coming over," I said. "We need to talk about this in person." The drive to Mom's house in Poway took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. I kept thinking about Jessica's nervous behavior, Ryan's veiled threats, and the way they'd both seemed so eager to get me out of their house. If they'd just borrowed the watch for a business investment, why hadn't Jessica simply told me the truth? Mom's house was a modest 2-story in a neighborhood that had been middle class when she and Dad bought it 25 years ago. After Dad died, Grandfather had insisted on paying for a new roof and updated windows, small improvements that kept the house from falling into disrepair, while Mom struggled to manage everything on a teacher's pension. She was waiting for me in the kitchen, the same room where Grandfather used to make us pancakes on Saturday mornings and help me with homework on school nights. Mom looked older than her 58 years, her brown hair streaked with gray, and her face lined with the kind of worry that comes from carrying too much weight for too long. "Tell me exactly what happened," I said, sitting across from her at the kitchen table. Mom wrapped her hands around a coffee mug, like she needed something to hold on to. "Jessica called about 3 weeks ago very upset. She said Ryan had found this amazing investment opportunity, some kind of commercial development in Arizona, but they needed $25,000 in cash to secure their position. $25,000. The watch was worth maybe $22,000 at most. She said they'd researched the value and found a buyer who collected vintage Rolexes, someone who'd pay top dollar for a piece with provenance and history. I felt sick. "And you just gave it to her?" Mom's eyes filled with tears. "She's my daughter, Evie. She was crying, saying this was their chance to finally get ahead, to buy a bigger house and maybe start a family. You know how much Jessica's always wanted children." I did know. Jessica had been talking about having kids since she got married, but somehow it never seemed to happen. Ryan always had some reason why the timing wasn't right, some business venture that needed their full attention first. "But Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice gentle despite my anger, "that watch wasn't just valuable because of its price. It was Grandfather's way of telling me he loved me. It was our connection to Dad, and to all the Sunday dinners and bedtime stories and everything that mattered about our family." "I know, honey." Mom reached across the table to take my hand. "And I know I made a terrible mistake. But Jessica promised they'd return it within a month. She said Ryan's business partner was just holding it as collateral until the investment funds cleared." Something about that story felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. Ryan struck me as the kind of man who'd have multiple credit lines and investment accounts. Why would he need to use his wife's inheritance as collateral for anything? "When exactly did this happen?" I asked. Mom looked uncomfortable. "About 3 weeks ago, like I said, but 3 weeks ago was right after the funeral, right after the will reading, which meant Jessica had made her move almost immediately before I'd even had a chance to properly grieve or think about what the watch meant to me." "Did you see any paperwork? Any documentation about this business deal?" "No," Mom admitted. "Jessica said it was all being handled by Ryan's business partner, someone with experience in commercial real estate. She seemed so confident, so sure this was going to work out for them." I closed my eyes and tried to think rationally about the situation. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this really was just a temporary arrangement, and Jessica would return the watch as promised. But every instinct I had was screaming that something was wrong, that I was missing some crucial piece of information. "I need Jessica's word that she'll return it," I said finally. "I need to hear from her directly that this is just a loan and that Grandfather's watch will be back where it belongs." Mom nodded eagerly. "Of course, I'll call her right now." But when Mom dialed Jessica's number, it went straight to voicemail. She tried twice more with the same result. "That's strange," Mom said. "She always answers when I call." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the kitchen. "Try Ryan's number." Mom scrolled through her contacts and dialed again. This time, the phone rang several times before going to voicemail. "Maybe they're both busy with work," Mom suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. I called Jessica myself and then Ryan with the same results. Both phones were either turned off or being deliberately ignored. For people who'd seemed so concerned about family communication just a few hours earlier, they'd certainly made themselves unavailable quickly. That's when the terrible possibility occurred to me. What if this wasn't a temporary loan at all? What if Jessica had already sold grandfather's watch and spent the money on whatever business scheme Ryan had convinced her to pursue, Mom? I said carefully. When exactly did Jessica say they'd return the watch? 30 days from when she borrowed it, Mom replied. So next week sometime. And if they don't? Mom's face crumpled. Oh, Evie, you don't think they'd actually sell it, do you? Jessica knows how much it means to you. But even as she said it, I could see the doubt in her eyes. We both knew Jessica well enough to recognize that she'd always been capable of justifying almost anything if it served her immediate needs. And we both knew that Ryan had a way of making his wife believe that his priorities should always come first. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to reach my sister, leaving increasingly frustrated voicemails and sending texts that went unanswered. By evening, I was forced to accept the possibility that grandfather's watch, the one tangible connection I had to the man who'd saved our family, might be gone forever. And if that was true, then Jessica had betrayed not just me, but everything grandfather had stood for. She'd taken something that represented love and sacrifice and memory, and she'd turned it into just another commodity to be traded for Ryan's latest get-rich-quick scheme. I woke up the next morning with a determination that surprised me. If Jessica and Ryan thought they could ignore me into submission, they were about to learn how wrong they were. I'd inherited more than just grandfather's love for precision. I'd also inherited his stubborn refusal to give up when something mattered. My first call was to Amanda Kim, my best friend since college, and currently a paralegal at Morrison & Associates downtown. Amanda had the kind of practical legal knowledge that came from years of helping attorneys navigate complex family disputes, and more importantly, she had the kind of personality that didn't tolerate bullshit from anyone. They did what Amanda's voice was sharp with indignation when I explained the situation. Evie, that's theft. I don't care if she's your sister or if your mom gave permission. The watch was specifically bequeathed to you in a legal will. I know, but proving theft when it's family members gets complicated, doesn't it? Everything gets complicated when family's involved, Amanda said. But you have options. First, you need to document everything. Every conversation, every text message, every voicemail. Second, you need to find that watch. That's where I'm stuck. I have no idea where to even start looking. Pawn shops, Amanda said immediately. If they needed cash quickly, that's the most likely place they'd go, especially for something valuable like a Rolex. Most shops keep detailed records for insurance and legal purposes. I'd never been inside a pawn shop in my life, but Amanda's suggestion made sense. If Jessica had really sold the watch, rather than using it as collateral for some mysterious business deal, a pawn shop would be the obvious choice for a quick conversion to cash. I called my boss at TechFlow and explained that I had a family emergency and needed to take a couple of personal days. Karen Rodriguez had been my supervisor for 3 years and had always been understanding about work-life balance issues. Take the time you need, she said. Family comes first, especially when you're dealing with estate issues. Those things can be incredibly stressful. I started my search that afternoon with a list I'd compiled from Google searches and Yelp reviews. San Diego County had more pawn shops than I'd expected, ranging from upscale establishments in tourist areas that specialized in jewelry and watches to smaller operations in strip malls that seemed to deal primarily in electronics and tools. My first stop was Hillcrest Jewelry Exchange, a clean, well-lit shop near the medical district that advertised expertise in luxury timepieces. The owner, a middle-aged man with careful eyes and steady hands, listened patiently as I described grandfather's Rolex. Submariner, 1970, stainless steel with a black dial. I said, showing him a photo from grandfather's insurance policy that Mom had found in his papers. It has a small scratch on the case back just above the serial number from where he knocked it against a doorframe years ago. The owner examined the photo carefully. "Beautiful piece," he said. "These vintage submariners are highly sought after, especially in good condition, but I haven't seen anything matching this description in the past month." I left my contact information and moved on to the next shop on my list. The pattern repeated itself over and over: polite attention, careful examination of the photo, and ultimately disappointing news. Nobody had seen grandfather's watch. By the end of the first day, I'd visited 8 shops and made dozens of phone calls. My feet hurt, my voice was hoarse, and I was no closer to finding the watch than when I'd started. But I'd learned something valuable. The secondary market for luxury watches was more complex than I'd imagined, with dealers, collectors, and brokers forming a network that extended far beyond simple pawn shops. The second day brought more of the same, though I expanded my search to include estate jewelry stores and watch repair shops. Some of the shop owners were more helpful than others, offering to check with their contacts or suggesting other places I might look. A few seemed suspicious of my motives, probably wondering if I was trying to track down stolen property for reasons that weren't entirely legitimate. It was during a call to Morrison's estate jewelry in Hillcrest that I got my first real break, though it didn't feel like one at the time. The owner, Frank Morrison, listened to my description and said something that made my heart sink. "Nothing matching that description right now," he said, "but let me keep your number in case something comes in. You'd be surprised how often items resurface in this business." I thanked him and hung up, adding his information to my growing list of contacts. By that point, I'd spoken to more than 30 shop owners and dealers, and the repeated disappointments were starting to wear me down emotionally. That evening, I called Jessica one more time, hoping that maybe she'd finally be ready to have an honest conversation about what had happened to the watch. When she answered, I could hear music and voices in the background, the sounds of people having a good time. "Evie," she said, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost guilty. "I was just about to call you back. I've been trying to reach you for 2 days," I said. "Mom told me about the watch, about how you borrowed it for Ryan's business deal." There was a pause, and then Jessica's voice became more guarded. "It's not what you think. It's just temporary until the investment funds clear." "When exactly is that supposed to happen? Because Mom said 30 days and it's been 3 weeks already. These things take time, Evie. Commercial real estate deals are complicated. There's paperwork and inspections and financing to arrange." "What's the name of the company Ryan's working with?" I asked. "I'd like to verify that everything's legitimate." Another pause, longer this time. "I don't think you understand how business works," Jessica said finally. "These deals require confidentiality agreements. Ryan can't just share details with family members, but he can use family heirlooms as collateral." "Look," Jessica's voice was getting sharper, "I know you're upset, but this is going to work out for everyone. When the deal closes, we'll all benefit. Ryan's already talking about buying you something nice to make up for the inconvenience." I felt like screaming. "I don't want something nice, Jessica. I want grandfather's watch. I want the specific thing he left me because it meant something to both of us." "You're being emotional about this," she said. "It's just an object, Evie. Grandfather would want us to use it to improve our lives. If it's just an object, then you won't mind returning it immediately." The music in the background stopped, and I heard Ryan's voice saying something I couldn't make out. Jessica covered the phone for a moment, and when she came back, her tone had changed completely. "I have to go," she said. "We're at a business dinner. Important clients. But I promise we'll talk soon and work everything out." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone and feeling more frustrated than ever. Everything about that conversation felt wrong, from Jessica's evasive answers to the timing of Ryan's intervention. They were hiding something, and I was starting to suspect that whatever it was, it went far beyond a simple business loan. That night, as I lay in bed thinking about the past 3 weeks, I realized something that made my blood run cold. If Jessica had really borrowed the watch as collateral for a legitimate business deal, she would have been eager to show me documentation to prove that everything was above board and that my concerns were unfounded. Instead, she was acting like someone who'd already done something irreversible and was desperately trying to buy time before the truth came out. And if that was the case, then grandfather's watch might already be gone forever, sold to some collector who had no idea of its emotional significance or family history. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Tomorrow, I'd expand my search beyond San Diego County. I'd call every reputable dealer in Southern California if I had to, because somewhere out there was a vintage Rolex Submariner with a small scratch on the case back, and I was going to find it even if it took me the rest of my life. The call came on Thursday morning while I was reviewing marketing reports at my desk, trying to focus on work, despite the constant knot of anxiety in my stomach. The number was unfamiliar, but something made me answer instead of letting it go to voicemail. "Miss Claire," a gravelly voice said, "this is Frank Morrison from Morrison's Estate Jewelry. You called yesterday about a Rolex Submariner." "Yes," I said, my heart immediately racing. "Did you find something?" "Well, that's the interesting thing," Frank said. "You called yesterday about a Rolex, and I told you I didn't have anything matching your description, but someone just brought that exact watch back to sell to me this morning. I nearly dropped the phone. Someone brought it back." "What do you mean?" "The person who bought it said it was defective, complained about some kind of mechanism not working properly, wanted to return it for a refund. Thing is, I can tell just by looking that there's nothing wrong with the watch mechanically." My hands were shaking as I grabbed my keys. "I'll be right there. Please don't sell it to anyone else." The drive to Hillcrest felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. Morrison's Estate Jewelry was tucked between a coffee shop and a vintage clothing store, its window display featuring an elegant arrangement of antique rings and necklaces. The interior was surprisingly spacious and well organized, with glass cases lining the walls, and a workbench visible in the back, where someone with steady hands and good eyes could examine delicate mechanisms. Frank Morrison was exactly what I'd expected from his voice, a man in his late 60s with silver hair and the kind of careful demeanor that came from decades of handling other people's treasures. He looked up when the door chime announced my arrival, and his weathered face softened with what might have been sympathy. "You must be Miss Claire," he said. "I have to tell you, in 35 years of this business, I've never had someone return a vintage Rolex claiming it was broken when there was clearly nothing wrong with it." He led me to his workbench where grandfather's watch lay on a soft cloth looking exactly as I remembered it. The familiar weight of grief and relief hit me simultaneously. It was really here, really safe, really possible to get back. "Your sister and her husband sold this to me 3 weeks ago," Frank continued. "Nice couple or so they seemed, but when I asked them about the watch's history, they didn't know much about it. Said it belonged to an elderly relative who'd passed away." "That elderly relative was my grandfather," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "He left it to me specifically in his will." Frank nodded slowly. "I thought there might be more to the story." The woman Jessica seemed nervous the whole time, and the man Ryan was more interested in getting the transaction completed quickly than in discussing the watch's provenance. He picked up the Rolex with careful fingers, turning it over to show me the case back. "This is when things get really interesting," he said. "I always examine pieces thoroughly before I buy them, looking for any issues or unique characteristics. That's when I found this." Frank pressed what looked like a nearly invisible seam on the case back and twisted slightly. To my amazement, a thin section of the metal slid open, revealing a tiny hidden compartment I'd never known existed. Many high-end watches from this era had secret compartments, Frank explained. Sometimes for an extra key, sometimes for a small photo or document. Rich folks used to hide microfilm or messages during the Cold War. Most people don't know about these features anymore. Inside the compartment was a small piece of paper folded so many times it was barely larger than a postage stamp. Frank handed it to me with the reverence of someone who understood that some discoveries changed everything. I unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. It was covered in grandfather's careful handwriting, the same script I remembered from birthday cards and grocery lists. But instead of a loving message, I found something that made my blood run cold. "RM. Check background," the note read. "Phoenix connections. Ask David about Nevada records. Protect family." Below that was a list of names and phone numbers, some crossed out, others circled. At the bottom, underlined twice, were the words, "Richard Mason." "These look like investigative notes," Frank said quietly. "Your grandfather was tracking someone." The name Richard Mason meant nothing to me, but the initials RM made my stomach drop. Ryan Mitchell, my sister's husband, the man who'd been so eager to get me out of their house, who'd made veiled threats about family loyalty and digging into the past. Frank was watching my expression carefully. "You recognize something," he said. "RM could be Ryan Mitchell," I said slowly. "My sister's husband. But I don't understand why my grandfather would be investigating him." Frank leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. "In my previous career before I opened this shop, I was a detective with the San Diego Police Department. 30 years on the force teaches you to recognize certain patterns, and what I'm seeing here looks like someone was building a case against Ryan. That would be my guess. The question is whether your grandfather finished his investigation before he passed away. I thought about the timing of everything: grandfather's death 6 months ago, Jessica's immediate move to borrow the watch, Ryan's sudden interest in keeping me from asking too many questions. If grandfather had been investigating Ryan and died before he could share what he'd learned, then Jessica might have no idea what kind of man she'd married. Or worse, she might know exactly what kind of man he was and had chosen to ignore the warning signs in favor of the lifestyle he provided. "I need to get this watch back," I said. "It's not just about the sentimental value anymore. If my grandfather was trying to protect our family from something, I need to know what it was." Frank nodded. "I understand completely. But there's a legal issue we need to address. I paid good money for this watch, and I have a legitimate bill of sale from your sister. Even if the circumstances are suspicious, I can't just give it back without proper documentation." "What kind of documentation? Proof that you're the rightful owner according to your grandfather's will? Something that shows your sister didn't have the legal right to sell it in the first place." I felt a surge of frustration. That could take days or weeks to organize, and every hour that passed was another hour for Ryan to realize that his secrets might be discovered. "I'll pay you what you paid for it," I offered, "plus whatever profit you would have made on the sale." Frank studied me for a long moment, his experienced eyes taking in my desperation and determination. $22,000, he said finally. "That's what I paid your sister and her husband. And Miss Claire, I'm not looking for a profit on this particular transaction. Something about this whole situation doesn't sit right with me. I didn't have $22,000 in my checking account, but I had savings and a credit card with enough available limit to cover the difference. The money wasn't the real issue. The real issue was what I was going to do with the information I'd found once I had the watch back in my possession. Because if grandfather had been investigating Ryan Mitchell, and if that investigation had uncovered something serious enough to warrant hidden notes and secret compartments, then my sister might be in more danger than just financial betrayal. She might be married to someone who was far more dangerous than any of us had realized. Frank was already preparing the paperwork when I made my decision. "I'll transfer the money this afternoon," I said. "But I need to ask you a favor. If Ryan or Jessica come back asking about the watch, or if anyone else comes around asking questions, would you call me immediately?" "Absolutely," Frank said. "And Miss Claire, if you find out what your grandfather was investigating, I'd like to know." In my experience, when someone goes to this much trouble to hide information, David Hayes had been grandfather's attorney for over 30 years, and his office reflected that kind of long-term relationship. The converted Victorian house downtown was filled with the accumulated wisdom of decades in legal practice law books that looked actually read family photos spanning generations, and the kind of comfortable furniture that suggested important conversations had taken place in these rooms. When I called that morning asking for an emergency appointment, David had cleared his afternoon schedule without question. Now, sitting across from his mahogany desk with grandfather's watch in my purse and the hidden compartment's contents spread between us, I was beginning to understand that my grandfather's final months had been far more complicated than anyone in our family had realized. "Your grandfather came to see me about 8 months before he passed," David said, adjusting his reading glasses to examine the handwritten notes. "He was concerned about Ryan Mitchell, though he didn't explain why initially. He just asked me to recommend a private investigator." "A private investigator?" The words felt surreal coming out of my mouth. Grandfather had always seemed like such a straightforward man, someone who dealt with problems directly rather than through subterfuge. "William was worried about your sister," David continued. "He said Ryan had appeared in Jessica's life very suddenly, with vague explanations about his background and business interests. Your grandfather's instincts told him something wasn't right." David opened a file cabinet and withdrew a thick folder marked with grandfather's name. William hired Marcus Webb, one of the best investigators in Southern California. What they discovered was troubling to say the least. He handed me a typed report that was at least 20 pages long. The cover page was stamped with a confidential seal and dated just 2 months before grandfather's death. My hands shook as I opened it and began reading. Ryan Mitchell was indeed a fabricated identity. The man my sister had married was actually Richard Mason, originally from Phoenix, Arizona. He had a criminal record spanning multiple states with charges ranging from financial fraud to identity theft. The pattern was always the same. He would target women with assets, often widows or divorcees, establish romantic relationships, and then systematically drain their resources before disappearing. The most chilling part of the report was a section detailing his previous marriages. Richard Mason had been married at least 4 times under various names, and in each case his wife had lost significant assets before the relationship ended. 2 of the women had filed restraining orders. 1 had simply vanished, though there was no evidence linking Richard to any physical harm. But this wasn't all. David reached into his desk drawer and produced another document, this one bearing official seals and legal terminology that made my head spin. "Your grandfather didn't just investigate Ryan," David explained. "He took steps to protect both you and Jessica financially. He established a trust fund with instructions that it only be activated if certain conditions were met." What kind of conditions? If Richard Mason's true identity was discovered and presented as evidence to the family, or if Jessica came to me seeking help regarding financial abuse or domestic violence, the trust contained $1.8 million money that grandfather had accumulated through careful investments over decades of modest living. He'd been far wealthier than any of us had realized, living in his small house and driving his old truck while building a fortune that could protect his granddaughters from exactly the kind of predator he'd discovered in our midst. He never told Jessica about any of this. I said more as a statement than a question. William was planning to confront them both after he received the final investigative report, David replied. He wanted to have all the facts before he acted. Unfortunately, his heart attack came before he had the chance. I felt a wave of grief that was somehow deeper than anything I'd experienced at grandfather's funeral. He'd died knowing that one of his granddaughters was married to a dangerous con artist, carrying that burden alone while trying to figure out how to protect us both, without destroying Jessica's life in the process. The timing of his death also explained why Richard had moved so quickly to pressure Jessica into selling the watch. If he suspected that grandfather had been investigating him, he would have wanted to eliminate any evidence before it could be discovered. "There's something else," David said gently. "Your grandfather specifically requested that if anything happened to him before he could reveal Richard's identity, I was to wait for you to discover the truth independently. He believed that if the information came from him posthumously, Jessica might not believe it, or might think he was trying to control her life from beyond the grave. But if I discovered it myself with evidence I could verify, she'd be more likely to listen. That was William's hope, yes. He knew you well enough to trust that you'd fight for the truth once you started looking for it." I thought about the past few days, my desperate search for the watch, the growing certainty that Jessica and Ryan were hiding something important. Grandfather had orchestrated this discovery using his final gift to me as a way to ensure that the truth would eventually come to light. "There's an active warrant out for Richard Mason in Nevada." David continued, flipping through the investigative file. "Securities fraud charges from a real estate scam that bilked elderly investors out of nearly $2 million. The FBI has been looking for him for 18 months. My sister is married to a fugitive. It appears so. And based on his pattern of behavior, he's been using her real estate connections to identify potential victims. Several of the clients mentioned in Jessica's recent sales records match the profile of women he's targeted in the past. The implications of this were staggering. Jessica wasn't just married to a con artist. She was unknowingly helping him identify and access new victims. Every client she brought to their house, every professional contact she shared, every social connection she maintained was potentially being evaluated for exploitation. "What am I supposed to do with this information?" I asked. "If I confront Jessica, Richard will know that his cover is blown. He could disappear again, leaving her to face the consequences of whatever crimes he's committed using her identity." David leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. William anticipated this dilemma. That's why he included specific instructions about the trust fund. If you present this evidence to Jessica, and she chooses to cooperate with law enforcement, she'll have the financial resources to rebuild her life after Richard is arrested. And if she chooses not to believe me, then she'll continue to be at risk, and you'll have fulfilled your grandfather's final request by giving her the choice. I looked down at the watch on my wrist, its familiar weight now carrying the additional burden of grandfather's unfinished mission. He'd spent his final months trying to protect both of his granddaughters from a threat we'd never even known existed. Now it was up to me to complete what he'd started, even if it meant destroying Jessica's marriage and everything she thought she knew about her life. The question was whether I had the courage to follow through with a plan that might save my sister's life, but would certainly break her heart. And whether Jessica would trust me enough to listen when I told her that the man she loved was not the man she'd married. Jessica's call came the next morning, catching me off guard, while I was still trying to figure out how to approach her with the devastating information David had shared. Her voice sounded strained, almost frantic, when she asked if I could come over to talk about the watch situation. "I think we need to clear the air," she said. "There are some things about Ryan's business deal that I should have explained better." I agreed to meet her at her house that afternoon, though I suspected this conversation was happening because Ryan had somehow learned about my visits to pawn shops. Maybe Frank Morrison had received a call asking whether anyone had been inquiring about a vintage Rolex. Maybe Richard Mason had contacts in the estate jewelry business who'd alerted him to my search. Either way, I was walking into what felt like a trap, armed with information that could destroy Jessica's world, but might also save her life. The house in Scripps Ranch looked the same as always, pristine, expensive, and somehow soulless. But now I knew that the perfection was an illusion funded by criminal activity and maintained through deception. When Jessica answered the door, I could see the stress she'd been hiding behind her carefully applied makeup. There were dark circles under her eyes and a tightness around her mouth that suggested sleepless nights and difficult conversations. "Come in," she said, leading me to the living room where Ryan was waiting with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Evie," he said, standing to shake my hand like we were business associates rather than family members locked in a conflict. "Jessica tells me you've been asking questions about our investment arrangement. I have the watch back," I said without preamble, deciding that directness was my best strategy. "I bought it from the pawn shop where you sold it 3 weeks ago." Jessica's face went white. "What do you mean, bought it back?" "Ryan said it was just collateral." Ryan's expression shifted subtly, the practiced charm replaced by something harder and more calculating. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said. "The arrangement we made was temporary, pending the completion of our real estate transaction." "No," I said, opening my purse and placing the investigative file on their coffee table. "There's been no misunderstanding. I know exactly who you are, Richard Mason." The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica looked between the file and her husband's face, confusion and dawning fear replacing her initial defensiveness. Ryan sat very still, his mind clearly racing through options and consequences. "Jessica," I said gently. "His real name is Richard Mason. He's wanted by the FBI for securities fraud. He's been married multiple times under different names, and he's been using your real estate contacts to identify new victims." "That's ridiculous," Jessica said, but her voice lacked conviction. She was looking at Ryan now, searching his face for the denial that didn't come. Richard finally spoke, his voice calm and controlled in a way that was somehow more frightening than anger would have been. "You have no idea what you're messing with, little girl. Some things are more complicated than they appear. Show her the warrant," I said, pulling out copies of the documents David had provided. "Show her the police reports from Phoenix and Las Vegas. Show her the pattern of fraud and identity theft that goes back 15 years. Jessica opened the file with trembling hands. I watched her face as she read about the man she'd been living with, the man she'd trusted with her money and her future and her heart. Each page seemed to hit her like a physical blow, and by the time she'd finished reading, she was crying silently. "None of this is true," she whispered, though she was still staring at official documents that bore Richard's photograph and fingerprints. Richard stood up abruptly, his mask of civility finally slipping completely. "This conversation is over," he said. "Jessica, we're leaving. Tonight." "No," Jessica said, surprising both of us. She was still holding the file, still processing the magnitude of the deception. I need to understand what's happening here. What's happening, Richard said, his voice turning cold, is that your jealous sister has fabricated a bunch of lies because she can't stand to see you happy. But these are official police documents, Jessica said, holding up the warrant. These have case numbers and court seals. How could Evie fake this? Richard moved toward the door, and I realized he was preparing to cut his losses and run. This was exactly what David had warned me about. Presenting the evidence would give Richard the opportunity to disappear before law enforcement could act. The FBI has been looking for you for 18 months, I said, blocking his path to the hallway. They know you're in San Diego. They know you're using Jessica's real estate business to identify wealthy clients for your scams. You have no proof of that, Richard replied, but there was desperation in his voice now. I have grandfather's investigation file, I said. He documented everything, including your pattern of targeting widows and divorcees with assets. He knew you were dangerous and he was trying to protect our family when he died. Jessica was reading the financial records now, seeing the evidence of multiple identities and fraudulent investment schemes. Her husband of 3 years was a stranger, a professional predator who'd built their entire relationship on lies. Richard made his decision quickly, moving toward the front door with the kind of focused urgency that suggested he'd planned escape routes from the beginning. But Jessica surprised both of us by stepping in front of him. No, she said, her voice stronger than I'd heard it in years. You're not leaving until you explain this. You're not running away and leaving me to deal with whatever mess you've created. Get out of my way, Jessica, Richard said, and for the first time I heard the threat that had probably been lurking beneath his charm all along. That's when I called 911. I'd been holding my phone ready since the moment I'd walked into the house, knowing that this confrontation could turn dangerous quickly. Richard heard me giving the address to the emergency dispatcher and realized his window for escape was closing. The next few minutes passed in a blur of shouted accusations and desperate explanations. Richard tried to convince Jessica that I was lying, that the documents were fake, that their love was real, even if some of the details about his past were complicated. Jessica wavered between wanting to believe him and accepting the overwhelming evidence of his deception. By the time the police arrived, Richard had admitted to using a false name, but claimed it was because of business disputes, not criminal activity. Jessica was sitting on her couch looking shell-shocked, surrounded by evidence that her entire marriage had been built on fraud. As they led Richard away in handcuffs, he looked back at Jessica with an expression that might have been genuine regret or might have been anger at losing a particularly valuable mark. I couldn't tell, and I suspected that after years of professional deception, he might not have been able to tell either. Jessica didn't speak to me for the rest of that evening. She sat in her perfect living room in her perfect house, staring at the official documents that proved her perfect life had been a carefully constructed lie. And I sat beside her wondering if saving her from Richard Mason was worth destroying every illusion she'd built about love and trust and the possibility of happiness. The next morning brought Detective Sarah Rodriguez to my apartment, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s who'd spent 15 years working fraud cases for the San Diego Police Department. She'd been assigned to coordinate with the FBI task force that had been tracking Richard Mason across multiple states, and she wanted to understand exactly how my family had become entangled with a federal fugitive. Your grandfather's private investigator did excellent work, she said, reviewing the file David had provided. This kind of detailed documentation is exactly what we need to build a comprehensive case against Mason. I made coffee while Detective Rodriguez spread photographs and documents across my kitchen table, creating a timeline of Richard's criminal activities that stretched back nearly 2 decades. The scope of his operation was staggering: dozens of victims, millions of dollars in losses, and a level of sophistication that suggested he'd been refining his methods for years. The pattern is always the same, Rodriguez explained. He targets women between 40 and 65, usually recently widowed or divorced with significant assets but limited experience managing finances independently. He spends months building trust before he starts asking for money. But Jessica isn't recently divorced, I said, and she's younger than his usual targets. That's what makes her case unusual, Rodriguez agreed. Based on what we've learned from other victims, I think he targeted your sister for different reasons. Her real estate license gave him access to client information, property records, and wealthy contacts that he couldn't get any other way. The thought that Richard had married Jessica specifically to exploit her professional connections made me sick. Every client dinner they'd hosted, every industry event they'd attended together, every casual conversation about successful deals had been opportunities for him to identify and evaluate potential victims. We found evidence in his computer files. Rodriguez continued that he'd been researching at least 12 of your sister's recent clients. Elderly homeowners, widows selling family properties, divorced women downsizing after settlements, all classic targets for the kind of investment scams he specializes in. So Jessica was unknowingly helping him build a victim list. It appears so. The good news is that we don't believe he'd actually approached any of these potential victims yet. Your grandfather's death and the subsequent investigation seems to have interrupted his timeline. Rodriguez showed me surveillance photos taken during Richard's arrest, images that captured the moment when his carefully constructed facade finally crumbled. He looked smaller, somehow less imposing than the confident businessman who'd intimidated me in his living room just days earlier. "We've been building this case for over a year," Rodriguez said. "Richard Mason, real name. Richard Eugene Morrison has active warrants in 4 states: securities fraud, wire fraud, elder abuse, identity theft. If convicted on all charges, he's looking at 20 to 30 years in federal prison." "What about Jessica? Is she going to face charges?" "That depends on several factors," Rodriguez replied carefully. "Intent is crucial in fraud cases. If she genuinely didn't know about his criminal background and wasn't participating in his schemes knowingly, she'll likely be treated as a victim rather than an accomplice." But there was another complication that Rodriguez explained, with the kind of professional detachment that came from years of dealing with financial crimes. Richard had convinced Jessica to sign various business documents over the course of their marriage, some of which might have legal implications depending on how he'd used her signature and real estate license. "The FBI is going through everything now," Rodriguez said. "Bank records, business filings, client contracts. We need to determine the extent of Jessica's legal exposure and whether she needs immunity in exchange for her cooperation." That afternoon, I received a call that changed everything. Lisa Thompson, a real estate broker from Phoenix, had seen news coverage of Richard's arrest and contacted the task force with information about her own experience with him 3 years earlier. I agreed to meet Lisa at a coffee shop in Mission Valley, though I wasn't sure what I expected to learn from another of Richard's victims. She turned out to be a woman about Jessica's age, professionally dressed and articulate, but with the kind of wariness that suggested she'd learned hard lessons about trusting people. "He destroyed my life," Lisa said without preamble. "Not just financially, though, that was bad enough. He made me doubt my own judgment, my ability to read people, my worth as a human being. That's what these sociopaths do. They don't just steal your money, they steal your confidence." Lisa had met Richard at a real estate conference where he'd presented himself as a successful investor looking for properties in emerging markets. Their business relationship had gradually become personal, and within 6 months, she'd invested her life savings in what turned out to be completely fictitious development projects. "The worst part was how convincing he was," Lisa continued. "He had documentation references, even fake partners who would corroborate his stories. I'm not a naive person. I'd been in real estate for 15 years, and I thought I could spot a con artist from a mile away. How did you finally realize what was happening?" "He got greedy," Lisa said. "Started asking for more money than the original investment required, claiming there were unexpected costs and regulatory delays. When I insisted on visiting the actual properties he'd shown me in photographs, he became evasive and then disappeared completely." Lisa had reported the fraud to local police, and the FBI providing documentation that had become part of the federal case against Richard. Her willingness to testify had been crucial in obtaining the warrants that led to his arrest in San Diego. "The detective who interviewed me said there were probably dozens of other victims," Lisa said. "Women who were too embarrassed or traumatized to come forward, or who didn't realize they'd been systematically defrauded rather than just unlucky in love." This conversation made me think about Jessica differently. Yes, she'd sold grandfather's watch and lied to me about it, But she'd also been manipulated by a professional criminal who'd spent years perfecting his ability to exploit trust and affection for financial gain. When I returned to my apartment that evening, I found Jessica sitting in her car in my parking lot. She looked like she hadn't slept since Richard's arrest, her usually perfect appearance replaced by exhaustion and confusion. "I need to ask you something," she said when I approached her window. "Did grandfather really leave money for both of us?" "Yes," I replied. "A trust fund worth almost $2 million. He set it up after he discovered Richard's true identity as a way to protect us both financially." Jessica started crying then, the kind of deep, body-shaking sobs that come from realizing how thoroughly you've been deceived. I got into the passenger seat and held her while she grieved for the marriage that had never been real, and the man who had never existed, except as a carefully constructed lie designed to exploit her dreams of love and security. The FBI raid happened at dawn on a Tuesday morning, and I watched from Detective Rodriguez's unmarked car as federal agents surrounded the sprawling house in Scripps Ranch that I'd visited so many times. The tactical team moved with practiced efficiency, their black SUVs blocking every possible escape route, while agents in bulletproof vests positioned themselves around the property. Jessica had spent the night at Mom's house in Poway, too frightened and confused to stay in the home she'd shared with a man who turned out to be a stranger. She'd given the FBI permission to search the property, hoping that whatever they found might help her understand how completely she'd been deceived. Richard came out in handcuffs, looking smaller and more ordinary than he ever had during his performance as a successful businessman. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by the hunched shoulders and careful movements of someone who knew his luck had finally run out. As they loaded him into the federal transport vehicle, he looked directly at me through the car window, his expression unreadable. He knows this is my fault, I thought, though I felt no guilt about bringing his criminal enterprise to an end. If anything, I felt a grim satisfaction that grandfather's final mission had been completed successfully, even if the cost to our family had been devastating. The search of the house took most of the day, with agents methodically documenting evidence and cataloging the sophisticated infrastructure Richard had built to support his fraudulent operations. Detective Rodriguez kept me updated throughout the process, describing the fake business documents, forged credentials, and computer files containing detailed profiles of potential victims. They found client files from Jessica's real estate business, Rodriguez told me during a brief break. Detailed financial information about elderly homeowners, recent widows, anyone who might be vulnerable to the kind of investment scams he specialized in. Some of these files had notations in his handwriting rating the targets by their potential value. The idea that Richard had been systematically evaluating Jessica's clients made me feel sick. Every dinner party they'd hosted, every casual conversation about successful sales had been opportunities for him to gather intelligence about potential victims. Jessica had unknowingly provided him with a steady stream of targets, their personal information carefully cataloged for future exploitation. That evening, Jessica called me from Mom's house, her voice hollow with exhaustion and shock. "They're saying I might have to testify against him," she said. "Detective Rodriguez wants me to cooperate with the prosecution." "Are you going to do it?" There was a long pause before she answered. "I don't know if I can face him in a courtroom, Evie. I don't know if I can sit there and tell strangers about how stupid I was, how easily he manipulated me." "You weren't stupid," I said firmly. "You were targeted by a professional criminal who'd spent years perfecting his techniques. None of this was your fault." "But I sold grandfather's watch," Jessica replied, and I could hear her crying. "I betrayed you and dishonored his memory because Richard convinced me it was the right thing to do." "How is that not my fault? Because he's a sociopath who specializes in making good people doubt their own judgment," I said. Lisa Thompson told me the same thing. These criminals don't just steal money, they steal your ability to trust yourself. The next few days passed in a blur of legal consultations and media attention that Jessica was completely unprepared to handle. The local news had picked up the story of the federal fugitive who'd been hiding in plain sight in one of San Diego's most affluent neighborhoods, and reporters were eager to interview the wife who'd unknowingly helped build his victim list. Jessica refused all media requests, but that didn't stop them from running stories about the case. The coverage was generally sympathetic, portraying her as another victim rather than an accomplice, but the public attention was devastating for someone who'd always prized her privacy and professional reputation. Her real estate license was suspended pending the investigation, effectively ending the career she'd spent years building. The house in Scripps Ranch went into foreclosure when it became clear that the mortgage payments had been funded by fraudulent investment schemes. Within a week, Jessica had lost her home, her income, and everything she'd thought she knew about her life. She moved into Mom's spare bedroom, bringing only the clothes and personal items that the FBI had cleared as unrelated to Richard's criminal activities. Everything else, from the expensive furniture to the luxury cars, was seized as evidence or sold to pay restitution to previous victims. I visited them both frequently during this period, trying to provide emotional support, while also dealing with my own complex feelings about the situation. Part of me felt vindicated that my instincts about Richard had been correct, but a larger part felt guilty for being the one who'd brought Jessica's world crashing down around her. The breakthrough came when Detective Rodriguez called with news that changed everything. "We found communications between Richard and several other co-conspirators," she said. "A network of criminals working together to identify and exploit victims across multiple states. Your sister's cooperation could help us bring down the entire operation." What kind of cooperation? Detailed testimony about how Richard operated, what methods he used to build trust and extract information. Jessica lived with him for 3 years. She saw how he worked even if she didn't understand what she was seeing at the time. The FBI was offering Jessica a formal immunity agreement in exchange for her full cooperation with the prosecution. She would avoid any criminal charges related to her unwitting participation in Richard's schemes, but she would have to testify publicly about the most humiliating period of her life. I drove to Mom's house that evening to discuss the offer with Jessica, finding her sitting in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by boxes of documents that the FBI had asked her to review. She looked years older than she had just weeks earlier, the stress and shame of her situation etched in the lines around her eyes. "Detective Rodriguez says your testimony could put him away for decades," I said, "and help convict the other people in his network." Jessica looked up from the financial records she'd been examining, her expression weary. "Do you know what it's like to realize that every conversation you had with your husband was a performance? That every 'I love you' was calculated to achieve a specific result?" I sat down beside her on the narrow bed, the same room where we'd shared secrets and dreams as children. "I can't imagine how painful this must be," I said, "but testifying might help you take back some control over your story." "Maybe," Jessica said, "or maybe it will just make everything public in a way that ensures I never recover from this." That night, she made her decision. She would cooperate fully with the federal prosecution, testifying about Richard's methods and providing evidence that could help convict not just him, but the entire criminal network he'd been working with. It was a choice that required enormous courage, but it was also the first step toward rebuilding a life based on truth, rather than the elaborate fiction that Richard had constructed around them both. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like my sister was truly coming home to the family that loved her, regardless of the mistakes she'd made or the pain she'd endured. The federal courthouse in downtown San Diego became a second home to our family over the next several months as Richard's case worked its way through the legal system. The prosecution had built an airtight case using evidence from multiple states, dozens of victims, and the detailed cooperation Jessica had agreed to provide. I attended every hearing partly to support my sister and partly because I needed to see justice served for the man who'd stolen grandfather's watch and nearly destroyed our family. Richard looked different in his orange jumpsuit stripped of the expensive clothes and confident demeanor that had made him seem so impressive when I'd first met him. The victim impact statements were the hardest part to witness. Woman after woman took the stand to describe how Richard had infiltrated their lives, gained their trust, and systematically drained their savings and retirement accounts. Many were elderly widows who'd been targeted during their most vulnerable moments. Others were divorced women trying to rebuild their lives after failed marriages. Margaret Chen, a 72-year-old widow from Phoenix, had lost her entire life savings to one of Richard's fake real estate investment schemes. She testified that she'd been forced to move in with her daughter's family and take a part-time job at a grocery store to make ends meet. Her voice shook as she described the shame of having to explain to her grandchildren why Grandma couldn't afford Christmas presents anymore. Jennifer Walsh, a 45-year-old teacher from Las Vegas, had refinanced her house to invest in what Richard had claimed was a sure-thing development project. When the project turned out to be completely fictitious, she'd lost her home and had to move her 3 children into a studio apartment. She'd been working 2 jobs ever since trying to rebuild the credit that Richard's fraud had destroyed. Each story was a variation on the same theme: trust exploited, saving stolen lives, derailed by a man who viewed other people's financial security as nothing more than raw material for his criminal enterprise. By the time the prosecution finished presenting victim testimonies, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Jessica's testimony came on a Thursday morning in early November. She'd been preparing for weeks with the federal prosecutors, reviewing documents and practicing how to explain the subtle manipulation tactics that had made her such an effective tool in Richard's operation. She looked fragile on the witness stand, wearing a simple navy dress that made her seem younger and more vulnerable than her 33 years. But her voice was steady as she described how Richard had gradually isolated her from our family, convinced her that grandfather disapproved of their marriage, and manipulated her into providing client information that he used to identify potential victims. The hardest moment came when the prosecutor asked her to explain why she'd sold grandfather's watch. Jessica's composure finally cracked as she described how Richard had convinced her that using the watch as collateral for his business deal would prove her loyalty and commitment to their marriage. He said it was a test, she testified, tears streaming down her face. He said that if I really loved him, I would trust him with something that precious to me. He made it seem like keeping the watch meant I was choosing my grandfather over my husband. Richard's defense attorney tried to portray Jessica as a willing accomplice who'd participated in the fraud schemes for financial gain, but the prosecution had documentation showing that Jessica had never benefited financially from any of Richard's criminal activities. All the money had flowed through accounts she'd never had access to, used to fund a lifestyle that was repossessed the moment Richard was arrested. The trial lasted 6 weeks with testimony from over 40 witnesses and evidence that filled dozens of boxes. Richard maintained his innocence throughout, claiming that he was a legitimate businessman who'd been the victim of overzealous law enforcement and vindictive ex-partners. But the jury didn't buy his performance. After deliberating for less than 8 hours, they returned guilty verdicts on all counts: wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and elder abuse. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following month, with Richard facing up to 30 years in federal prison. The media coverage of the trial had been extensive, with local news stations running regular updates on what they called the Scripps Ranch con man case. Jessica's role as both victim and unwitting accomplice made her a particularly compelling figure for reporters, though she continued to refuse all interview requests. The attention was devastating for her professionally. Even though she'd been cleared of any criminal wrongdoing, the real estate industry in San Diego was small and reputation-dependent. Several firms that had initially expressed interest in hiring her withdrew their offers once the full scope of the case became public. Frank Morrison surprised everyone by offering Jessica a job at his estate jewelry store. He'd followed the trial closely and was impressed by her courage in testifying against Richard, despite the personal cost. "The work won't make you rich," Frank told her during their first meeting. "But it's honest, and there's something to be said for dealing in things that have real value rather than elaborate promises about future profits." Jessica accepted the position, starting at the bottom as a sales assistant, but grateful for the chance to rebuild her career in an environment where her past wouldn't define her future. Frank's customers were often selling family heirlooms during difficult times, and Jessica's experience with loss and betrayal made her uniquely qualified to provide the kind of compassionate service they needed. Lisa Thompson visited San Diego for the sentencing hearing, wanting to see Richard finally held accountable for the crimes that had derailed her own life 3 years earlier. She and Jessica met for coffee, 2 women who'd been targeted by the same predator but had found different paths to recovery. "You saved my life by exposing him," Lisa told Jessica. "If he'd continued operating, there would have been dozens more victims, maybe hundreds." "It doesn't feel like I saved anyone," Jessica replied. "It feels like I was part of the problem." "You were a victim who found the courage to fight back," Lisa said firmly. "That's the only reason any of us got justice." When the judge announced Richard's sentence, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. 12 years in federal prison with requirements to pay full restitution to all identified victims. It was a substantial punishment, but it could never fully repair the damage he'd done to the women he'd targeted or the families he'd torn apart. As they led Richard away to begin his sentence, he looked back at Jessica one final time. I couldn't read his expression, but I hoped he understood that the woman he'd tried to destroy had ultimately been the instrument of his downfall. The trust fund that grandfather had established was finally activated, providing both Jessica and me with the financial security he'd wanted us to have. For Jessica, it meant the ability to rebuild her life without the pressure of immediate financial survival. For me, it was validation that grandfather's love and foresight had protected us even after his death. 3 months after Richard's sentencing, Jessica and I found ourselves sitting across from Dr. Patricia Martinez in a family therapy office in Mission Valley. The sessions had been Mom's idea, though she'd presented it as a suggestion rather than a demand. Our family had been through trauma that none of us knew how to process alone, and professional guidance seemed like the only way to rebuild relationships that had been damaged by years of deception and manipulation. Jessica looked different now working at Morrison's estate jewelry. The desperate edge that had defined her during her marriage to Richard was gone, replaced by something steadier and more authentic. She'd lost weight not from stress, but from the physical activity of walking to work and eating regular meals instead of the expensive restaurant food that had been part of her previous lifestyle. Frank Morrison had become an unexpected mentor figure, teaching Jessica not just about jewelry appraisal and estate sales, but about the emotional weight that objects could carry for their owners. Many of his customers were elderly people selling family heirlooms to pay medical bills, or women disposing of jewelry from failed marriages. Jessica's own experience with loss made her uniquely suited to help them navigate these difficult transactions with dignity. "The work doesn't pay much," Jessica told Dr. Martinez during one of our sessions, "but there's something healing about helping people find value in things they thought were worthless, or letting go of things that were keeping them tied to painful memories." Mom had been attending the sessions too, though she mostly listened rather than spoke. The revelation that she'd enabled Jessica's theft of grandfather's watch by giving her access to the safe had been devastating for a woman who'd spent her entire adult life trying to be fair to both her daughters. "I never meant to choose between you," Mom said, during a particularly emotional session. "After your father died, I was so afraid of making mistakes that I ended up making different mistakes instead." The breakthrough came when Dr. Martinez asked us to bring something that represented our family bond to the next session. I'd been planning to bring one of grandfather's old photographs, but Jessica surprised me by producing a small creased picture from her wallet. "This is from Dad's funeral," she said, handing it to Dr. Martinez. "We're all standing together in our black clothes, but grandfather has his arms around both of us. Mom gave it to me years ago, and I've carried it through everything that happened with Richard, even when I felt completely disconnected from you both." I stared at the photograph, remembering that terrible day when we'd buried my father, and wondered how our family would survive such a devastating loss. Grandfather had been our anchor during that period, holding us together through his quiet strength and unwavering presence. Seeing physical proof that Jessica had carried that memory with her even during the worst moments of her marriage made me realize how much pain she must have been in to risk losing that connection. The sessions continued through the winter, helping us navigate the complex emotions that came with rebuilding trust after betrayal. Jessica's willingness to take full responsibility for her actions without blaming Richard's manipulation or diminishing the impact on our family was crucial to the healing process. "I made choices," she said during one particularly difficult conversation. "Richard influenced those choices, but I'm the one who decided to trust him over my own family. I'm the one who sold something that wasn't mine to sell. I can't undo that, but I can make sure it never happens again." The revelation about the trust fund that grandfather had established added another layer of complexity to our family dynamics. Jessica initially refused to accept any money from the trust, insisting that she didn't deserve financial support after betraying grandfather's wishes about the watch. But David Hayes explained that grandfather had anticipated this reaction, leaving specific instructions that the money was to be distributed equally, regardless of the circumstances that led to its activation. He'd understood that families sometimes made mistakes, and he'd wanted to ensure that forgiveness was built into his final gift to us. The money allowed Jessica to rent a small apartment in Hillcrest within walking distance of Morrison's store and close enough to visit Mom regularly. It wasn't the luxurious lifestyle she'd enjoyed with Richard, but it was honest and sustainable, built on her own efforts rather than criminal proceeds. One afternoon in late February, while Jessica was processing an estate jewelry collection, she discovered something that changed everything again. Hidden in the lining of an antique jewelry box was a safety deposit box key, along with a note in grandfather's handwriting that neither of us had seen before. The key opened a box at Wells Fargo that contained not just additional legal documents, but a letter addressed to both Jessica and me. Grandfather had written it during his final weeks when he knew his heart was failing, but before he'd had the chance to confront Richard directly. "My beloved granddaughters," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the truth about Richard has finally come to light. I want you both to know that I never stopped loving either of you, regardless of the choices you made or the pain you may have caused each other." The letter went on to explain his decision to hire the private investigator, his agonizing choice about whether to confront Jessica directly about Richard, and his ultimate faith that we would find our way back to each other, despite the trauma his discoveries might cause. Jessica is not the first woman to be deceived by a skilled manipulator, he'd written, and Evie is not the first person to carry anger about injustice done to someone she loves. But you are both strong enough to survive this crisis, and you are both worthy of forgiveness and love, especially from each other. The most powerful part of the letter was his final paragraph, which Jessica read aloud while we sat in the bank's small conference room, both of us crying freely. "The trust fund is not a reward for good behavior or a payment for past mistakes. It is my way of ensuring that my granddaughters will always have the resources to choose love over fear, forgiveness over resentment, and family over the forces that would divide you. Use it wisely, but use it with the knowledge that you are both precious to me beyond measure." That evening, we visited grandfather's grave together for the first time since his funeral. The cemetery was quiet in the fading light, with only the sound of distant traffic to disturb the peace. We stood beside his headstone, each lost in our own memories and regrets, and hopes for the future. "I'm sorry I disappointed him," Jessica said quietly. "I'm sorry I let Richard's lies become more important than the truth he was trying to tell me." "You didn't disappoint him," I replied. "You were human. You made mistakes, but you also found the courage to fix them when it mattered most." As we walked back to the car, Jessica mentioned something that I'd been hoping to hear for months. "Frank introduced me to someone," she said almost shyly. "Another customer, a man whose wife died last year and who's been selling some of her jewelry. He's kind and honest, and he knows about everything that happened with Richard." It was the first time Jessica had mentioned dating since Richard's arrest, and the fact that she was ready to trust someone new felt like genuine progress, rather than just another attempt to fill the emptiness in her life. "Do you think grandfather would approve?" she asked. "I think grandfather would want you to be happy," I said. "Really happy, not just performing happiness for someone else's benefit." That night, for the first time in almost a year, our family felt whole again. Not perfect, not without scars, but whole in the way that mattered most. We'd survived betrayal and deception, and the kind of trauma that destroys some families permanently. We'd chosen forgiveness over resentment, truth over comfortable lies, and love over the fear that had almost torn us apart. 1 year after Richard's sentencing, I found myself standing in the same cemetery where we'd buried grandfather, but this time the visit felt like a celebration rather than a memorial. Jessica stood beside me, her engagement ring catching the afternoon sunlight as she placed fresh flowers on his grave. The ring wasn't expensive or flashy like the jewelry Richard had bought her with stolen money, but it was real, chosen by a man who loved her for who she actually was, rather than what she could provide him. Michael Chen was a high school history teacher whose wife had died of cancer 2 years earlier. He'd met Jessica at Morrison's store when he came in to sell his late wife's jewelry, not because he needed the money, but because keeping it felt like holding on to grief instead of cherishing memories. Jessica had helped him select pieces to keep for his teenage daughter, while finding good homes for the rest, and their friendship had grown slowly into something deeper and more genuine than anything she'd experienced with Richard. Frank Morrison had become something like a second grandfather to both of us, filling the void left by William's death with his quiet wisdom and steady presence. The jewelry store had thrived under Jessica's management, partly because she understood the emotional weight of family heirlooms, and partly because her experience with fraud made her exceptionally good at spotting fake pieces and questionable provenance. Detective Rodriguez had stayed in touch throughout the year, updating us on Richard's appeals and the ongoing investigation into his criminal network. 3 other co-conspirators had been arrested based on evidence found during the search of the Scripps ranch house, and the FBI estimated that their combined operations had defrauded victims of over $15 million across a dozen states. The victims' support group that Lisa Thompson had started in Phoenix had expanded to include chapters in 6 cities, providing counseling and legal resources for people recovering from financial fraud. Jessica had spoken at several meetings, sharing her story as both a victim and an unwitting accomplice, helping other women understand that healing was possible even after devastating betrayal. "Your grandfather would be so proud of you both," Mom said, joining us at the graveside. She'd retired from teaching the previous spring, using part of her inheritance from the trust fund to travel and volunteer with literacy programs. The guilt she'd carried about enabling Jessica's theft of the watch had gradually transformed into a determination to honor grandfather's memory through service to others. I touched the Rolex on my wrist, feeling its familiar weight, and remembering all the Sunday dinners and bedtime stories that had shaped my understanding of love and loyalty. The hidden compartment was empty now, its secrets revealed and its purpose fulfilled, but somehow the watch felt fuller than ever, with meaning and connection to the man who'd saved our family twice, once when Dad died, and again through the investigation that exposed Richard's true nature. Jessica had gotten her real estate license restored after completing additional ethics training and community service requirements. She'd chosen to specialize in helping fraud victims navigate property transactions, using her experience to protect people during one of the most vulnerable periods of their lives. The work was meaningful in ways that her previous career had never been, focused on service rather than commission, and built on genuine expertise rather than artificial relationships. The trust fund had transformed all our lives, but not in the way I'd initially expected. The money itself was important, providing security and opportunities we wouldn't have had otherwise. But the real gift was understanding that grandfather's love had been powerful enough to reach beyond death, protecting us from dangers we hadn't even known existed, and providing resources for healing that we desperately needed. Frank Morrison joined us that afternoon at the cemetery, bringing news that would have made grandfather smile with satisfaction. The FBI had recovered and returned jewelry and valuables to dozens of Richard's victims, including pieces that had been sold to legitimate dealers who'd unknowingly become part of his money laundering operation. "There's something poetic about stolen treasures finding their way home," Frank said, his weathered hands gentle as he adjusted the flowers on grandfather's grave. William would have appreciated that kind of justice. As we walked back to our cars, I reflected on how completely our family had been transformed by the events of the past year. We'd lost the illusion of Jessica's perfect marriage and the comfortable fiction that love alone could protect us from the world's dangers. But we'd gained something more valuable, the knowledge that we could survive betrayal and trauma without losing our capacity for forgiveness and growth. Jessica's wedding was planned for the following spring, a small ceremony in the garden behind Mom's house with only family and close friends in attendance. Michael's teenage daughter had already accepted Jessica as a stepmother figure, bonding over their shared experience of loss and the gradual process of building new family structures from the pieces of broken ones. The business cards for Jessica's new real estate practice included a small logo of interlocking hearts, a subtle reference to her commitment to helping families navigate major life transitions with integrity and compassion. Her first client had been an elderly widow selling her family home to move into assisted living, and Jessica had spent weeks ensuring that the woman received fair value for the property while connecting her with resources for estate planning and senior services. That evening, as we gathered for dinner at Mom's house, I looked around the table at the faces of the people I loved most in the world. We weren't the same family we'd been before Richard's deception was exposed, but we were stronger in ways that mattered more than the superficial harmony we'd maintained through silence and avoidance. Jessica raised her water glass in a toast, her voice steady and clear. "To Grandfather William," she said, "for teaching us that true strength means protecting the people you love even from dangers they can't see coming, and for showing us that forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past, but about choosing love over fear when building the future." As I touched Grandfather's watch one more time that night, I realized that the story I'd been telling myself about family and loyalty and justice had been incomplete. I'd thought that destroying Richard meant destroying the lies that had controlled Jessica, but the real victory was much simpler and more profound. We'd chosen to love each other despite our imperfections and mistakes, and that choice had been powerful enough to heal wounds that had seemed irreparable. Sometimes the greatest revenge against those who try to divide us is simply refusing to stay divided. Sometimes justice looks like a family sitting around a dinner table sharing stories and laughter, and the kind of love that survives even the most devastating betrayals. And sometimes the most precious inheritance isn't money or jewelry or property, but the courage to forgive and the wisdom to trust again. The watch ticks steadily on my wrist as I write this marking time that moves only forward toward a future built on truth rather than deception. And in its quiet precision, I hear the echo of Grandfather's voice reminding me that some things once broken can be repaired in ways that make them stronger than they ever were before. What would you have done if you discovered that your family member had been deceived by someone with a criminal past? Have you ever had to choose between exposing a painful truth and protecting someone you love? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who might need to hear about the power of family forgiveness and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and remember that sometimes the most important battles we fight are the ones that protect the people we love from dangers they can't see coming.